So remember last week I mentioned that the story of Aquarius and this first exile in Babylon, remember I said it's the center point of the story of God? You guys remember that comment? Talked about how stories are typically structured, and usually at the midpoint there's something major that happens that spins the story into a heightened state of conflict that really begs resolution and puts a lot of, let's say, a higher demand and burden on whoever the main character might be. But the story of Aquarius, I think it holds special significance, not because of just the position of where it sits in the midpoint of the Mazzaroth, but because it covers the story where God is just beginning, or I should say finally beginning to bring the consequences that he's been warning his people for close to 1,000 years. Right? If we go back all the way to Moses in Mount Sinai and the law and the book of Leviticus, where we actually see one of the first instance of the exile actually being foretold, it's about close to 1,000 years between when Moses wrote Leviticus to the point where they actually were taken captive in Babylon. And like I've said many times throughout this particular series, like nobody can accuse God of being capricious and reactive. We see back when he said, I'm giving the Amalekites 400 years to repent, right? And here he doesn't bring his people into captivity until 1,000 years after he first said, guess what? You're probably going to disobey me and there's going to be a consequence, right? So it's not like God is capricious in nature and just kind of reacting and almost like we do as human parents, right? I'm sure there are moments where all of us who have been parents or are parents have brought consequences to our children in the heat of the moment, and those are things we always regret, right, when we start to look back. But God isn't like that, right? There's this forbearance and there's this long suffering. Last week we talked about why the first exile was 70 years long. Does anybody remember why it was 70 years and where we can go to kind of prove that biblically or scripturally? Well, Jeremiah said in chapters 25 and 29, he gave us the time frame. He basically spelled it out, and it says you're going to go into captivity for 70 years. And it was 1 year for each of the land Sabbaths that was missed. And that connection between the exile and not observing the land Sabbaths was actually first made by Moses back in Leviticus 26, where he prophesied the first exile. He also he connected it to the certainty that once the Jews got into the promised land, that they were going to be disobedient. They were going to fail to keep the Sabbaths, the land Sabbath specifically. So it's, again, clearly spelled out. Sometimes you don't see these things until you look back in retrospect. Right? We have the benefit of hindsight being 2020. But were Jeremiah and Moses the only ones who foretold the disobedience of Israel in the exile? I actually gave you two other people who foretold it. One was Joshua, when he divided the lands among the tribes, and once they got to a certain point where they had conquered most of the nations that were in Canaan, God said, okay, that's enough for now, go ahead and let everyone go back to the lands. And so Joshua divided up the lands, and at that time he gave a speech to the people much like Moses did in Deuteronomy, where he kind of laid out the history and then said, listen, here's what's going to happen. You're going to disobey and God's going to bring some consequences. So Joshua foretold it. And then there was one other, and we covered this in our last session, and that was Solomon, right? When Solomon dedicated the first temple and when he blessed the people, he predicted the exile as well. And he condemned himself, his future self, by pointing out that God's obligation to keep his covenant and to bring mercy was only to those who followed him with all of their heart, like his father David did. Right? So out of his own mouth, he spoke his own condemnation. But when we look at that phrase, follow God with all your heart, what does that mean? And I'm not going to answer this one for you. Someone's going to have to answer it. What does it mean?
Denying yourself, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if you deny yourself, that's the biggest thing in order to follow Christ.
Yeah, because you got to get out of the way, right? Because if you're not denying yourself, you're almost putting yourself in the position of God in your life, right? You're just following lust of the flesh, or different terms, right? The desire of your belly or something like that. What else? And I think the obvious answer would be, God says you have to do these things. Well, guess what? You have to do those things. But I think about David's reaction when God took his newborn. So following God with all your heart is not just following the guidelines, but it's accepting the consequences when you're disobedient, right? And we all are. We're all disobedient, one time or another, one degree or another, over some things that might be inconsequential, and sometimes over things that actually are very consequential. But David's example, I think, is very profound. And you look at all these stories in the Bible, and they're there for many different reasons, but I think David's example is so poignant, just because it's so profound. It's so profound. God took his son, and David could have argued, he could have got mad, he could have turned away from God, but he beseeched him, he fasted, he prayed, he laid down on his face before God, begging him not to take his son. But when he did, he got up and acted as if nothing had ever happened. He calmly accepted the consequences. Now, that was an individual person, but you can kind of zoom out and look at the nation as a whole and think about how the nation ends up going into exile, and then they're allowed to return. So God took away their sovereignty, and he put them into captivity and subjugation, and in essence, to some degree, slavery, not to the same extent that they saw certainly in Egypt. But we have to ask ourselves, ultimately, in the long run, did the nation behave the same way that David did? Did the nation behave that way? Probably not, right? So following God is not just about following the rules that he's laid out, but it's gracefully accepting the consequence when we do things we're not supposed to. We've been warned about them, and we pay a consequence, right? We have no right to grumble or to complain. We also spent just a couple of minutes talking about Solomon and how he agape loved his harem of wives and concubines, right? He not only allowed his wives to worship these false gods in Israel, but he went one step further and he built places of worship. He built high places for his wives and his concubines to worship demons. And he went one step even further than that because he participated in that. It says that he went after the foreign gods and he worshiped them. And that phrase "went after" means the same thing as if you were to say, okay, I'm following God, I'm following Jehovah or Yahweh. He went after and he followed these demons. And it's one thing for an everyday, regular Joe Jewish person to have done that. It's quite a different thing when the steward of the Lord's inheritance does it. Completely different altogether. So what happens next, and how did Israel go from being united under David and Solomon to being the divided kingdom? Because that's really ultimately what this period of time is all about. Do you guys remember what God said to Solomon? God appeared to him several different times, but this is what God said to Solomon in 1 Kings 9. And this is when he appeared to him the second time. He says, "But if you or your sons at all turn from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them. In this house which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all the peoples." And he also said this in chapter 11, so 1 Kings 11:11. He said, "Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my commandment and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I'll give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." So we see this tearing, right? And there's really kind of a progression here because we've seen this metaphor or symbolism of something being torn away before. We saw it back in 1 Samuel when Samuel tore Saul's cloak, and that was a sign that Saul was going to be removed as the steward or as the king of Israel, right? But the kingdom itself remained intact, right? What happened with Saul was that he was disobedient as the steward, and Saul was torn away from the kingdom, but the kingdom, for the most part, remained as it was. But with Solomon, and did I say Saul or Solomon just then?
He said Solomon.
Okay, I meant Saul. Because we got Saul, Solomon, and Samuel. It's kind of hard to keep them all straight. Okay, so what happened with Saul was that God tore him away from the kingdom, but for the most part, the kingdom itself was intact. But with Solomon, what God did was he allowed him to remain as the king, but he tore the kingdom in two. Same thing, kind of done a little bit of a different way, right? But God had mercy on Solomon in doing all this. And this is just, I think, God being true to his own words. Because back in 2 Samuel, when he spoke the Davidic covenant to David and talked to David about his son, and this is where, Solomon had the possibility of being the Christ. He says in 2 Samuel 7:15, "But my mercy shall not depart from him," where he was referring to Solomon, "as I took it from Saul." So what he's saying there is, hey, when I tear the kingdom from Solomon, I'm not going to tear Solomon away from the kingship or away from the stewardship, but we're going to break the kingdom in two, right? That was foretold as part of the Davidic covenant. And he says, "In your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne," and he's talking to David here, "your throne shall be established forever." So by God's own words, he could not have removed Solomon as king. Couldn't do it. So he had to do something else, which was breaking the kingdom in two. So God waited until Solomon died, and he removed part of the kingdom from his son, as we'll see just here in a moment. But there's an interesting potential conflict in how God is doing all of these different things. We know that, or hopefully we know, that eventually the line of Solomon was cut off, right? And we'll deal with that story. I don't know if we'll get to it today, but certainly in our next lesson. But we know eventually the line of Solomon was cut off from the throne. And because of that, from about 586 BC onward, there has never been a king on the throne of David. And we're talking about 2,500 years of history. So the question is, if God said to David, "You will have someone sitting on your throne will be established forever," yet he cut off the line of Solomon, is God a liar? And we've dealt with this question before, because there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that if you don't understand the story of God, it looks like God is a liar, a deceiver, a cheater, and he's never any of those things. He's never any of those things, right? But he did promise David one of his sons would sit on the throne forever. So how do we understand this, knowing that God doesn't lie, but it looks like he did? Well, I think the answer lies in the word forever. He says, "Your throne will be established forever." It lies in the understanding of the forever and which son eventually sets up the eternal kingdom. And that word son doesn't mean immediate descendant like Solomon or Nathan or any of the sons that David physically fathered. It can also mean descendant, right, over many, many different generations. So I think the answer is tied up into understanding forever, which son sets up the eternal kingdom, and when the eternal kingdom begins. In other words, like it says on the screen, the promise of God was about continuity and longevity and permanency. But nowhere in any of the statements that God made to David during the Davidic covenant did he define the starting point. He kind of gave us the end point, but didn't say when it was going to happen, right? That was left open-ended, and it was left conditional, which is why we see statements like from God to Solomon, "when your sons are disobedient," right? So there was possibility, but there was never fulfillment because everybody was disobedient. Now, in reality, God's promise to David could have been fulfilled one of two ways. And instead of making you guess, because you guys are painfully silent already, one way that God could have fulfilled this would be to have a succession of mortal kings who always remained faithful and perfect in their obedience. That's one way he could have done it. A succession of mortal kings who were perfectly obedient generation to generation to generation and generation. Or he could have a single obedient immortal king, which kind of sounds like someone we know, right? So when you kind of like take this and twist it around and look at it from different directions, I see three things that are required for God's promise to be fulfilled. And this is how we know what the starting point is when we start talking about the Davidic covenant actually being fulfilled. And so those three things would be having a throne, right? David's throne would be established forever. We would need a legitimate king and an obedient king sitting on the throne, and we would have to have a clean and a consecrated temple for worship to happen under a faithful high priest and a faithful priesthood. Right? And if you look at all the prophecies and all the descriptions of the kingdom, this is exactly what has to happen and what has to be in place for us to say, okay, this is it. This is the end. This is the fulfillment, and here we are. To say it another way, the promise won't be fulfilled until there's a single descendant of David who has kept both the personal moral law of the law of Moses and is himself the immortal, rightful heir of all things, who sits on an eternal throne and worships in the eternal temple and is not just a steward. Go back to that idea that when Saul was crowned king, he was told that he was the commander of the inheritance of the Lord. He was given temporary authority over things that did not belong to him. They belonged to the heir. He was just holding it. He was just taking care of it. And there's the same thing for every Jewish king from that point forward until we get to Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's not a steward. He owns it all. He's come back, and he came back to basically proclaim himself, and he will be coming back to claim it all and put things right. And so when we look back, when we look from where we are in history right now, what God has done in the bigger picture, and looking at, in the story of Aquarius, which really the Babylonian captivity happened somewhere around 600 BC. Actually, there were several deportations. We look at the date of 586 BC as being the Babylonian captivity, but there were actually 3 different deportations that happened over a decade or so. But what God has done, and I know we haven't really gone into the depths of the details of the story yet. The first thing that God did in the bigger picture was he removed Solomon as king, or the line of Solomon as kings from the throne of David. And in doing so, he temporarily removed any of David's descendants from the throne, any of them. And the second thing he did in 586 BC under the Babylonians, not only was that the end of the line of the Davidic kings, but he also temporarily removed that first temple. And so it was impossible for God to fulfill his promise during that time because there was no king. The line was cut off. The throne, the temple was destroyed, had to be rebuilt, which didn't happen for 120 years later. That's when it was completed, right? 70 years of captivity. And then when Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel came back, it took them 50 years to complete the rebuilding of the second temple. So if you think of it this way, in the next Mazzaroth sign that we'll get to in about 2 weeks, the story of Pisces, where the Jews are allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild that second temple. When they came back from captivity, they rebuilt the temple. They had a priesthood, but they still had no king. Right? And even after the second temple was restored, not restored, but destroyed, because we're in that time gap right now between the second and the third temple. In the time frame we're in right now in history, we have a king, but there's no temple and there's no priesthood. God can't fulfill his promises. It's not time yet, but the time is coming, right? We won't have all of the elements in place until Christ himself returns, and we have a throne, a legitimate, immortal, perfectly obedient king with a cleansed and consecrated temple where Christ himself functions as the perfect high priest, then we have a restored priesthood, right? Which includes all of us. It's not just the Jews. So if we go and we kind of look at some of these pieces, right? And this is a little bit of a side comment here, but looking forward to the kingdom, in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, clearly Ezekiel shows a cleansed and a restored temple in the kingdom, right? So we know that the temple will be in place, and so that checks one of those three things off our list. Go to Revelation 22 just for a second here. This is John's vision of the New Jerusalem on earth. Right? So we know from Ezekiel there's going to be a restored temple in the New Jerusalem. Revelation 22:1 says, "And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb." So there's your throne. "In the midst of the street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb," right? Your immortal, perfectly obedient king, "shall be in it, and his name shall serve them," or his servant shall serve him. "They shall see his face, his name shall be on their foreheads. There shall be no night there. They need no lamp nor light of the sun, for the Lord God gives them light, and they shall reign forever and ever," right? That's ultimately the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. If you drop down to verse 13 and 16, just a few verses later, Jesus makes this connection between John's vision of the restored temple and throne and the king being there. And he says in verse 13, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." And in verse 16, "I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star." Now we've seen this verse many times, right? But I want you to know that when John writes this, when Jesus is speaking it, when he says, "I am the offspring of David," he uses the definite article "the." He says, "I am the offspring of David." He's not saying, I'm just a descendant of David." It's not kind of a general appeal to genealogy. He is staking a claim, and he's saying, "I am the one. I am the son of David that all these prophecies have pointed to." And that's the force of that little word "the." I am the offspring of David. Now, obviously, I've given away the end of the story, right? The son and the heir of David on his throne in the kingdom, leading his people with a cleansed and consecrated, restored temple. Christ himself fulfilled the personal moral law of Moses when he came to earth the first time. And when he comes back to claim his throne, he's going to be fulfilling the terms of the Davidic covenant, because he's already fulfilled the Mosaic, right? He's going to fulfill the Davidic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and the inheritance covenant, all at one time. All at one time. But from where we are in the story, in Aquarius, there's a long and winding path from that point to Leo the lion, which represents the lion of the tribe of Judah, right? So we need to get back to the story of Aquarius. It just kind of took us on a little time travel there and look forward. Go back to 1 Kings 11. And let's talk about actually how the kingdom was split in two and the circumstances that happened around that. 1 Kings 11. And while you're flipping there, we're going to start in verse 29. This is during Solomon's reign, right? So he's still alive. And there's another man, Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is described in the opening verses of 1 Kings 11 as a mighty man of valor. He was the head of Solomon's labor force from the tribe of Joseph. Jeroboam was responsible for building the citadel. He was responsible for building the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And according to 1 Kings 14 to 28, Jeroboam was one of three adversaries that God raised up against Solomon because of Solomon's infidelity, because of his agape love for his harem of wives and then falling into idolatry himself. So in verse 29, "Now it happened at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. So we see another example of this tearing and the symbolism related to it. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me, and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David. Right? So we see this continued use of the tearing of a garment symbolizing either removing someone from a position of authority, or in this case, the breaking of the kingdom. But notice verse 33, because I had said in one of our previous lessons, talking about Solomon's infidelity, I had made a comment about I didn't see any direct statements that suggested that the nation followed his example. Well, here it is in verse 33. Because it says, because they, plural, have forsaken me. It wasn't just Solomon. It was Solomon and the entire nation, right? And this goes back to, why was God so upset with Solomon? He failed the personal and moral law because he intermarried with pagan women who he and every other Jew had been warned, if you do that, they're going to turn your hearts away from God. But what ended up happening was his personal infidelity, spiritual infidelity, had a national impact because he's the one, as the steward of the Lord's inheritance, who set the standard for the whole nation. And we see that pattern play out over and over again through 1st and 2nd Kings and the books of Chronicles. Let's pick it up in verse 34. He says, however, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I've made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David. You know what this reminds me of? When God is talking to the entire nation of Israel, he says, listen, you're not my favorite because you're awesome people or you're the biggest nation on earth. You're my favorite people because I love Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? The nation of Israel only enjoys special privilege in the eyes of God, number one, if they're obedient, and because of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And that's it. That's where it begins. That's why the nation has its favored status in the eyes of the Lord. But it's tied to Abraham, and it's also tied to the obedience. Same thing here, right? Solomon, God had mercy on him because of David. Not because of Solomon, but because of David. Verse 35, but I will take the kingdom out of his son's hands and give it to you, 10 tribes. And to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself to put my name there. Verse 37 is the key one. So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you, and build for you an enduring house as I built for David, and will give Israel to you, and I will afflict the descendants of David because of this, but not forever. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now, what is God doing with Jeroboam here? Is God replacing the house of David with the house of Jeroboam? Well, if he was, we'd run into a couple problems. It would make him a liar. Because he said that the Messiah was going to come from the tribe of Judah, and he made an unconditional promise to David that his son would sit on the throne. So if God in this passage here was replacing the house of David with the house of Jeroboam, he'd be going against his own word. So what he's doing here with Jeroboam is he's giving him the opportunity to have his own dynasty. And here where it refers to I'll give you, you can reign over your heart's desire and you'll be king of Israel. He's talking about the northern 10 tribes. Because remember, Abijah or Ahijah, the prophet here, tore his garment, tore it into 12, and he gave 10 pieces, only 10. He didn't give the 2 pieces that represented David and Benjamin. So now we have a circumstance where the kingdom is split, and it's a lopsided split. It's not 50-50. 10 tribes are aligning with Jeroboam, and if he follows the same rules that God set out for David, then he can have his own dynasty, he can have his own deal, but he still had to remain faithful to Jehovah, to the commandments, to the statutes, and he would, even though he wasn't the steward of the Lord's inheritance, the way that the lineage of David is, he still had to follow all the rules. And it said, if you do that, you can have anything you want. But of course, again, that's not the Davidic covenant. We wouldn't expect the Messiah to come from Jeroboam, which, does anybody know what tribe he was from? He was from Ephraim, like one of the half tribes of Joseph, right? So again, there's no way that God could have been replacing David's lineage and his dynasty. He was just giving him a chance to create another one. We saw before how God was willing to accept Solomon as the Christ if he was obedient, perfectly obedient. With Jeroboam, God was willing to allow the 10 northern tribes to continue somewhat independently of the house of David, but they still had to follow the same requirements, which of course they didn't, right? And that failure happened very, very quickly, and that became a problem. Now, King Solomon dies, and as soon as Jeroboam hears that, he comes back to Jerusalem, because remember, he's in Egypt, right? When the prophet told Jeroboam that God was going to do this, Solomon sought to kill him. So he fled off to Egypt. Now he's back. And after Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam turns out to be not so great as the steward. He's not a great king, right? He's middle-aged. We learn later he's like 41 years old when he begins to reign. But he's petty. He's power-hungry. He seeks counsel from his younger friends rather than Solomon's experienced and wise advisors. And his young friends basically tell him, you got to be hard on your people, right? And in fact, let me just explain some context here. Solomon was a wise leader. He was. The kingdom thrived. The kingdom was at peace during his entire reign. But there was a lot of hard work. It took a total of 20 years to build the temple and to build his house, like Solomon's palace. Let me just read this just to give you an idea of how much work happened in those 20 years. 1 Kings 5:13, if you want to read it on your own at some point. Then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains, besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised the work, who labored in the work, or the people who labored in the work. And the king commanded them to carry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. It's a lot of back-breaking work. And how was it financed? Well, there was gifts from Hiram, king of Tyre. He and Solomon were very good friends. So when Rehoboam took control after his father died, on the advice of his younger peers, he said to the people, you think your life was hard under my father? Guess what? And the people rebelled, right? And they were led by Jeroboam, who already had friends within the labor force because he was the head of the labor force of the house of Joseph, or the house of Ephraim. Go to 1 Kings 12. This is that story, 1 Kings 12:15. So the king, this would be Rehoboam, did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord. Now what this tells us is that what's happening with Rehoboam and his stubbornness and the people's reaction, this is part of God's plan, right? This was not accidental. This was part of God's plan. So the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now when all Israel saw that King Rehoboam did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, what share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So Israel departed to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Now let this sink in for a second. When they say we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, what does that even mean? What inheritance is tied up in David, the son of Jesse? Well, it's the inheritance, right? It's everything. It's everything that the Jews had come to expect, whether you describe it as part of the Davidic covenant or the Mosaic law or the Abrahamic covenant, and ultimately the inheritance covenant with the Son. But when they proclaimed in unison, we have no share, we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, they were in essence disinheriting themselves. Like, we don't want any part of this. Rehoboam, you're not our king. This guy is. Now, which is interesting because the turn of events was from the Lord. Again, this was not necessarily people acting out of turn and being disobedient. They were doing exactly what God wanted them to do. Exactly what they wanted to do. Going back to this idea of them disinheriting themselves, the only way that any Jew can participate in the inheritance or in the inheritance covenant in the Abrahamic covenant was by following the law of the Mosaic covenant under the leadership of the king of the Davidic covenant. It's the only way you can be part of that. And God created an opportunity when he said to Jeroboam, listen, if you will be obedient like David did, you can rule these people. And he set the same conditions and said, I will allow you to still be part of this whole pattern and plan if you will obey me. But when they said we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, they were stepping outside the terms of the agreement. Right? And this is the agreement that was ratified multiple times at Mount Sinai. If you remember back in the story, and this is like Exodus 19-ish, 20-ish, there were several times when Moses gathered the leaders of the tribes of Israel and read the law and make sure they understood all the consequences, but all the payoff. And they said, whatever the Lord God says, we will do. And it was ratified in blood. Yeah, go ahead.
I always thought of that verse as when David cut off from Saul, and then Saul and David ended up with just that little part. Those two people, Judah that he was ruling over, and then Saul had the other 10. But when David took over, I always thought their mind went back to Saul. Saul was really our original king.
Yeah, but Saul was part of the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah.
And Benjamin was the one tribe that God gave to Rehoboam, right? Okay. So the two southern tribes were the tribes of David and the tribe of Saul.
Okay.
So as it relates to this split between the north and the south kingdoms and the house of David and the house of Jeroboam, Saul himself and his lineage doesn't really fit into it.
Okay, but I was thinking that was their mindset, though. We're going to go back to Saul, where he reigned over us. You know what I'm saying?
Not quite, but try it again. Try it one more time.
It's kind of like a rebellion now.
Yes.
At first, we became one under David.
Yep.
Because Saul no longer exists now, so we're going to go ahead and go along with you now, David. But when things happen with Solomon, okay, we're going back now to the way it used to be when Saul used to reign over us. We don't want David anymore. We don't want any part of that.
Yeah. So the only tweak to that, because I think you're right in general, the only tweak is they're not saying we're going to go back and follow the way things were with Saul. They're following Jeroboam.
Yeah.
Because they knew at this point that God had spoken to Jeroboam that he would be the king of the 10 northern tribes, right? And we know that that was, or at least should have been, public knowledge, because Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam because of the prophecy.
Yeah.
And he did just what like Saul did, right? Saul, it seemed like Saul thought if he killed David, everything would be okay, even though David had already been anointed king. Strange stuff, right? Let's continue in verse 18. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue. So basically he was a tax collector. But all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. And now from this point on, in general, the term Israel refers to the disobedient north, where Judah refers to the kingdom of the south, right? And there are some exceptions, but that's the general rule. There was none who followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only. Now, that would include the tribe of Benjamin, which by this time, because Benjamin had almost been entirely wiped out and they lived in the region of Judah, when you see the tribe of Judah, it typically includes a reference to the Benjamites as well. And when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin. So here what we see is the northern tribes going, we want nothing to do with Jesse. We're making Jeroboam our king. Everyone to your tents. Take care of yourself, house of David. And now Rehoboam, the king, goes, I need to take care of this. So he musters 180,000 warriors in verse 21 to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying, speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and there's that inclusive reference there, and to the rest of the people, saying, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up nor fight against your brothers, the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. These events were from the Lord. This thing is from me. He's saying, Rehoboam, chill out. I've split the kingdom. I'm the one who did it. Therefore, they obeyed the word of the Lord and turned back according to the word of the Lord. Now, here's a question. What is God responsible for here? Right? It does say the turn of events, and this thing was from the Lord. Can we blame God for making the northern tribes go astray and being disinherited? Can we blame God from that? Because he created the circumstance, right?
No, you can't blame God.
Why not?
Because God knew their hearts and their wickedness prior to this.
What did he say to Jeroboam? Follow the rules and life will be really good for you.
Yeah.
He promised a dynasty just like David's if he would be obedient. So God created the circumstance, but he gave the northern 10 tribes as a whole and each individual Jew of Israel and Jeroboam, he gave them a choice. Like he always does. He always spells out the consequences on the good side and on the bad side. Right? With Jeroboam, go ahead.
It's almost like he really knows what is in your heart.
Yeah.
But what he does is he just draws it out so that you can see it.
Kind of like using Pharaoh, right?
Mm-hmm.
He knew what Pharaoh would do.
It's like
Same thing with Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Right? He's a pagan, but God used him for his purpose.
Yes.
Same thing with Cyrus.
Yeah.
So the intent with Jeroboam was that he would be a faithful king over his own dynasty, and the people that he ruled over would be faithful as well. That was the intent. There was nothing wrong with the northern tribes splitting away from David and following Jeroboam, because this thing was from the Lord. There was nothing wrong with that. The issue was what happened afterwards. and maybe there was a little bit of a misunderstanding among the people that God was transferring the Davidic covenant to Jeroboam, and if so, they just didn't understand the Davidic covenant or the nature of God. But we know that Jeroboam could never have rightfully assumed David's throne because he was from the wrong tribe, and God had spoken. And we'll look at Jeroboam's failure soon enough, but look back at verse 17. where it says the kingdom split, right? And it says, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Note that it doesn't say that he only reigned over people from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. It said all the children of Israel who chose to live in Judea. Creating a circumstance, and this is my understanding as I read this, is that any Jew who chose to remain faithful to the house of David, no matter what tribe they belonged to, could have moved to the south and lived in Judah. Now we know this happened with the Levites. Go to 2 Chronicles 11 for a second. 2 Chronicles 11. This is a parallel account to 1 Kings 12:21. But there's one detail here that the account in 1 Kings doesn't have. 2 Chronicles 11 verse 1. Now when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled from the house of Judah and Benjamin 180,000 chosen men who were warriors. And it goes on to say that, God said in verse 4, you shall not go up or fight against your brethren. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. Therefore they obeyed. Then it says Rehoboam in verse 5 dwelt in Jerusalem. And in verses 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, it talks about all the cities that Rehoboam built up as defensive cities. In verse 11, he fortified these strongholds, put captains in them, and stores of food and oil and wine. Also in every city he put shields and spears and made them very strong, having Judah and Benjamin on his side. And from all their territories, the priests and the Levites who were in all of Israel took their stand with him, meaning Rehoboam. For the Levites left their common lands and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them from serving as priests to the Lord. The entire tribe of Levi, scattered throughout the entire land of Israel proper, pledged their allegiance to the house of David and moved out of the northern territories and down into Judea to serve in the temple in Jerusalem. So it seems to me that when the kingdom split, anyone who wanted to remain faithful to David and to his lineage and to the Davidic covenant, no matter what tribe they came from, could have moved into the south, and probably did, because the entire tribe of Levi did it. Now go back to 1 Kings 12. Now we see Jeroboam making some decisions that he really has no right to make, like who would be a priest to the Lord in his kingdom, but he didn't stop there. So 1 Kings 12. Verse 25. This is after the kingdom is split and Jeroboam has gone into the north. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim. That was his home region, right? Ephraim and Joseph. And dwelt there. Also he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam. So he knew that one of the key aspects of Jewish culture and life was the center of worship. And he wasn't satisfied with the conditions that God set. Because when God told Jeroboam, listen, you can take these 10 tribes and be your own king, man. If you're obedient, you'll have everything you want, but you still have to worship in Jerusalem. He said, that's not going to work for me. Verse 28, therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to his people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set one up in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. Now he's inventing, it's bad enough to prevent people from going to Jerusalem, setting up his own centers of worship, his own temples, having golden calves that they idolized. Now he was making his own priesthood. Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. And by the way, that's around the time of Halloween. like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And at Bethel he installed the priests of the high place which he had made. So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel, and offered sacrifices on the altar and burned incense. Now take a look up on the map and up on the screen there. This is the divided kingdom, right? So we have Judah down here in the south, right, including Israel, which is really at the top end of the region of Judea. Then there's the borderline right here, and you can see Bethel, which is just north of Jerusalem, just west of Jericho. And then we have Dan all the way up here, up by Tyre and Sidon. So basically he said, I'm going to put a temple in the north of my land and in the south, so that no matter where they live, they have no excuse to go anywhere but the places that I say they can go worship. I'll put this on WhatsApp if you want, because I have more. Because Jeroboam's system of false worship, right? He set this pagan festival. He built 2 pagan temples with 2 golden calves. And it seems to me that's a direct reference back to Aaron and the golden calf when they came out of Egypt. Moses was up on the mountain, and when Moses and Joshua were coming down, they heard the sound of people cavorting and playing, and they came down and they were worshiping a golden calf. He's like what gives? I've been gone for a few weeks. Right? So I think he's relating it directly back to that. So Dan in the north, Bethel in the south. Now Bethel, anybody, well, I have it up on the screen there. What's significant about Bethel, which is just on the other side of Jericho? It was the first place that the Jews camped in when they crossed the Jordan with Joshua. And that's where Joshua set up those 12 memorial stones. Same place. And it says that Jeroboam built and lived in Shechem, which Shechem is just kind of up in this region right here. I don't have it on the... Oh, there it is right there. Up in Shechem, right? It's actually became the capital city of Samaria, which is this region right in there. This is also the same place where Jesus met the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And I want to take a look at that. I want you to go to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. So I think what happens naturally as we keep working our way through these Mazzaroth signs, we're getting closer and closer to the time of Christ, right? We actually only have 2 more Mazzaroth signs there. We have Pisces, and then we have Aries, which is the Lamb of God. So I think it would be natural that as we work our way through these stories, that the connections to the story of Christ himself and the things that come after would become more direct, and probably more important for us to now start jumping forward, to start seeing how where we are in the Mazzaroth, how that connects to what's happening a little bit down the line. We've spent a lot of time up to this point kind of going backwards and making connections between the first half of the story and now the middle of the story. As we go on, now we'll start making connections as we go through the later end. So in John chapter 4, just to give you some context, Jesus and his disciples are traveling to Galilee, but he has to go through Samaria to get there. Now Galilee, this is the Sea of Galilee right here, right? So Nazareth, where Christ was born, is just kind of right up around here. So Galilee is up here, and then we have Samaria, and then we have Jerusalem, right? So if Christ is in Jerusalem and wants to go home, he's got to go through Samaria to do that. It's about noon. Jesus stops at a well. In fact, he stops at one of Jacob's wells. It's called Jacob's Well. And in the account of John chapter 4, the city is called Sychar, but Sychar is kind of the newer name for Shechem. It's the same place. At least it's the same region. Samaritan woman shows up, and he asks her for water. And then this is where he starts talking about living water, right? Anyone who takes the water that I give is not going to be thirsty anymore. Then he tells her about her life. He talks about her 5 past husbands and says that the man you're with now is not your husband. And she says this in John 4:19. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain." And she's referring to Mount Gerizim, which we didn't cover this when we went through Libra, but back in the story of Moses, before before he handed the reins over to Joshua, he had people stand on two separate mountains facing each other, and they pronounced the blessings on one and the cursings on another. Gerizim was one of those. So our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place we ought to worship. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. And literally, and this is how Tim translated it, it's true to the Greek, it literally means salvation is out of the Judeans. And he's referring to the Messiah coming from the Davidic line, right? We can't escape this connection that the Messiah would come from the line of David, the house of Judah. Has to happen that way. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. Imagine that they were having a polite disagreement. Where's the right place to worship? The Samaritans said Mount Gerizim. The Jews said Jerusalem. And she's going like, listen, I know we don't agree, but when the Messiah comes, he'll sort it all out. That's in essence what she's saying. So when he comes, he will tell us all. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. He reveals himself to her. Now think about the background here for a second. Because this lady lives in the world created by Jeroboam's idolatry and disobedience. That's why she has these beliefs and attitudes, because of Jeroboam. She's a half Jew, right? Samaritans were half Jews. She had a tenuous hold on the truth of God. She had inherited a mixture of truth and lies. They believed that they worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just like the Jews did. But they did it their way, kind of like Jeroboam. They had their own version of the Torah, their own version. They did it in their own temple on their own mountain. But that's a world that Jeroboam created. But it's clear that they expected the Messiah. Very clear that from her words, like when Messiah comes, he's going to sort all this stuff out. And I want you to notice the patience and the grace that Christ had for her because of her ignorance. Because her ignorance, ultimately, we're all responsible for our own beliefs. But I think you can lay a lot, the responsibility for her ignorance at the feet of Jeroboam and all of the people who came back and came after him that perpetuated this lie that you can step out of God's covenant and create your own stuff, and God is going to still treat you like you were in covenant with him. And that's a reminder to me to be patient with, new or immature or uneducated Christians learning poorly from unfaithful shepherds, which unfortunately I think is the larger part of modern Christianity. Not that we have the corner on all the truth, right? We make plenty of mistakes. We're just actively trying to figure out where they are so we can fix them. So what does Jesus mean that a time was coming when true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth? What does that mean?
Could that be at the end of the age and during the millennium?
I think ultimately means that. I think he was, I sum it up in two statements. No physical temple, no mistakes. In spirit and truth. And I think he was referring initially to the original apostolic church, right? The local assembly. Right? Because where does worship happen in the church age? Right here. We don't have a temple that we go to. Jesus says, you are the temple of God. And we are the temple of God, and God's presence dwells among us when we gather in fellowship, right? Then if you're confused and all that, go back to all of Tim's teachings in the BBI on the nature of the fellowship, right? The nature of the church. Make that really, really clear. So the local assembly, the original local assemblies, headed by the apostles, held the pristine faith. But ultimately, I think you're right. It's going to be in the kingdom when we have the throne, we have the perfectly obedient, immortal king who is the heir of all things and also happens to be the high priest, praising and serving God in a cleansed and consecrated temple in the New Jerusalem. Amazing how it all connects together, right? Now let me close with this. And this is kind of an interesting side note. Where was Jesus born? What city? Born in Bethlehem, right, which is down here, right next to just outside Jerusalem. Square in the heart of Judea, or Judah. Or not square in the heart, that would be more like Hebron, but certainly towards the north, the middle north part. Where did Jesus live? Where was he from? Nazareth. Up here in the north. Galilee is part of northern Israel, which was created when God tore the kingdom in two and gave Jeroboam a chance that he failed miserably at. And from the moment that God tore the kingdom away from Rehoboam, those northern 10 tribes went pagan and stayed that way. Yet from the belly of the pagan nations, or the pagan tribes, comes the Messiah. So while Jesus was of the line of David and born in Bethlehem, he was raised in the north, around Samaria, probably surrounded by Samaritans, who believed that they should be worshiping in Gerizim and not Jerusalem, that had their own version of the Torah, and they had their own festivals and their own ways of doing things that were not authorized by God. Yet he and his family and many others made the required trips to Jerusalem. Think about the story of when Christ was 12 and he was found teaching in the temple. How did he get there? Because he and his family and probably a whole bunch of tribal people made the trek from Nazareth down to Jerusalem to observe the festivals. And when his family left to go back home, he stuck there and was teaching in the temple. Yeah.
Maybe that's why they would say, how can anything good
Come out of Nazareth. Yeah. I think that what this shows is that even though the north went pagan from Jeroboam forward, there was a remnant among those northern tribes that remained faithful and true. And there was probably a bunch of people who were in their minds doing what was right, what they thought was right, but weren't, probably more so because they lived in and were brought up in a false system. And either didn't think to question, didn't know to question, wouldn't dare to question. So I said a moment ago, what we're starting to see now in the story of Aquarius is that these connections to the story of Christ, the Mazzaroth sign of Aries, are becoming more direct. They're starting to get sharper in their focus. But as we learn the history, we should be able to make some of the connections in the New Testament, like understanding where the woman in the well was coming from. Why was she thinking and saying the things that she was thinking in John 4? Why did Jesus have a conversation with her in the first place? Is it just a nice little story going, oh, isn't that great? The Messiah is talking to a Samaritan woman. Because that's what his disciples focused on, right? Lord, why are you talking to a woman, let alone a Samaritan? They were like, I don't know if they were horrified, but they certainly thought it was improper. But there was bigger stuff going on. Jesus was bridging the gap. He was reaching out to his brethren, if you will, who had lived in the north. And he was saying, listen, I'm here. Because their expectation is the Messiah would come and he would sort out the differences between the Samaritans and the Jews. Where and how is the right way to worship? And Jesus said, in spirit and in truth. And we know later, AD 70, the temple was destroyed. Jesus became the king of the Jews, or he always has been the king of the Jews. So we had a king, but no temple and no priesthood after AD 70. So now this is where worship happens, in spirit. And that breath refers to his presence among us, where he says, where two or three are gathered together, there I am among them. He was talking about the ecclesia. All right, I'm going to leave it there because we're just over an hour. Any questions or any comments on this one? Yeah.
We're the same people.
What do you mean?
As
As them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see it's the similarity of we're repeating. It's just like history constantly repeating. And we reach a point where we're doing real good, and then somehow it splits.
Yep.
And we start all over again, and we start again doing good, and we think we got it, and it seems like ever ending.
I think that this is one of the dangers of modern Christians not knowing the history of God and the value of knowing the history. Go ahead.
One person said that history repeats itself, kind of thing, and then another person said history doesn't repeat itself, but it surely does rhyme. I forgot who said that. It was someone else that just modified that version.
Yeah.
And that's why I tell people all the time, the reason why we continue to make these mistakes is because we don't listen to our elders, the people that have experienced life, and
Yeah.
we neglect our history.
Yeah.
Thinking that we know better or that we're smarter, and I'm just like, okay, keep doing your life. Go ahead.
Yeah. Setting your own rules,
All right.
doing it your way.
Yeah.
And this is, and I am guilty of having said this, right? Oh, God knows my heart. Well, sure he does, but he also knows the conditions that we agree to, right? And this is, and not to pick apart too many details, but I think about what a shame it is for people in any given church just to answer an altar call. Never, number one, never be baptized, but even those who are baptized really not knowing the significance. Not understanding that that's when you enter into a covenant that has terms and conditions. And that, yes, God is patient. But if you disobey to an extreme or frequently enough, he will bring the consequences because he is faithful and true. And he's faithful and true for both the blessing as well as the consequence and the curses.